This class is brought to you by the M.A.G Network and is part of our monthly education series. To find out about upcoming online and in-person events, subscribe and like our YouTube channel, or join our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/groups/M.A.G Network. If you have comments or suggestions for possible upcoming classes, email them to mag.network@outlook.com.
Hello and welcome to the M.A.G Network. We are happy to have Mike Kidwell from the Lizard Patch Farmstead in Mississippi with us. He will be talking with us about composting and soil nutrients. Mike is one of our M.A.G Network moderators and the owner and administrator of Mississippi M.A.G, and can be reached there or via the Lizard Patch Farmstead Facebook page for any additional questions. We will have a link to their page in both groups at the end of this video. So welcome and please enjoy. All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Indy Guy with the M.A.G Network, and tonight we have Mike Kidwell with the Lizard Patch Farmstead in Mississippi. He's going to be talking to us about composting and soil nutrients. So, Mike, share your wisdom with us, sir. And again, appreciate you sharing your time with us. And I think this is the second time you've been with us, so appreciate you sharing and spending time with us tonight.
All right, no problem. Thank you, Indy, and thanks to the M.A.G Network for making this happen. You know, it's good to have something like this where we can try to get info out and share what we know with each other, and we really appreciate it from our side. So thank you. Like you said, my name is Mike Kidwell. I'm from the Lizard Patch Farmstead. We've been homesteading out here for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. I didn't grow up on a farm or anything. This is something I'm all trying to figure out on my own through research and experimenting and trials and all this type of stuff. So compost is a pretty important part of doing this. You know, I don't like to use chemical fertilizers, and I would rather make things out of things that I have. So compost is just right up it, and I've learned a lot about it. Hopefully I can teach you guys something. I'm going to try to keep it simple and to the point. Dirt is something that I can just talk quite a bit about. If you would have asked young Mike, like if you saw this coming, that I could just sit around and talk about dirt for hours, I probably wouldn't have imagined that. But there's a lot to learn. And even with getting my notes together for this, it kind of showed me again all the little rabbit holes that you can get down with it. But like I said, I'm going to try to get to the point. I'm going to keep it simple. I just want to explain how everything works as far as making compost, the different types of compost, and the nutrients that go along with it, and why you want certain types of compost and don't want other types, and just to get you thinking. And then you can figure out on your own where you need to research more and push it. So what is compost? You know, just simply, it is decomposed organic matter. You can take compost and make it out of almost anything from leaves to grass clippings to eggshells to things you eat in your house, animal manures. You want to break it down over time. As it breaks down, it decomposes into the different nutrients that plants need to grow, just essentially plant food. So you're trying to create plant food is pretty much all you're doing there with it. When you have different starting materials, like I was saying, the leaves, the eggs, the animal manures, you end up with different nutrients in your compost. The different nutrients are required for different plants. Like when you first, let's say you're doing a tomato plant, when you first plant it in the ground, it's going to require more nitrogen than it does phosphorus or potassium or anything like that, because it's growing leaves. And I'll get into that in a minute and everything too. And then as it matures and starts to produce fruit, you actually kind of want to change your compost up to something that's going to help you produce the fruit a little better. Now you can make a generalized type of compost and use it on everything, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It works great. It's better than nothing. But when you're dealing with your organic foods and things like that, if you provide the right nutrition for the plant, not only are you going to get better growth, you're going to get more nutrition in your food as well. It's kind of like when you go to the grocery store and you see the tomatoes and you cut it open and it's white on the inside. It's filled with water. There's not much nutrition to it. You know, you take a nice homegrown tomato that's been grown organically with the right type of compost, and you cut it open, it's bright red. You can taste the flavors. You can smell it as soon as you cut it. There's a huge difference. So while you can create one type of compost, it is best to do several different types and to think about it that way and provide the types of food that that plant needs at that time. There's many different ways to compost. Everybody's kind of got their own preferred methods, and it all depends on how active in it you want to be, how quickly you want to get your compost, or, you know, do you need compost in 2 months? Do you need it in 6 months? Could you mind waiting 2 years? How much work do you want to put into it? So we're going to go over all that in a minute too, but let's start with the nutrients. You know, you're going to use your compost. You want to break down the organic stuff into the nutrients. So I'm just going to go over the basic nutrients that you see. When you go buy fertilizers, there's those numbers on the front. It'll say something like 10-9-9 or something like that. Those are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are 3 of your most important nutrients that you can provide to your plant. They're part of what's considered the macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. These are nutrients that your plant use in large quantities. There are also uses carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but it gets those from water. It gets it from the air, the carbon dioxide in the air. That's actually 90% of the plant mass can be just the carbon, the hydrogen, and oxygen. But that's not something you typically need to worry about. You know, in a greenhouse, a lot of times they'll add carbon dioxide to the air to make the plants grow faster and things like that. But just dealing with stuff like this, you don't need to worry about that. The main ones, like I said, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. There are micronutrients as well: boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, zinc, molybdenum, and nickel. Most of the time, you don't need to worry about those. Any soils or compost that you make, it's going to provide that on its own. There are times that you could deplete something, but you don't need to really worry about that. So when you're dealing with compost, you're just focusing on the macronutrients. Now this is a part where you can get into a wormhole. I'm really going to try to keep it simple here, because each of these nutrients, I could actually do one class on each nutrient. You could really get into it, how it works, how to get it, and everything like that. But the first one, your main nutrient that you need to worry about in most compost and homemade fertilizers, is nitrogen. It is very easily depletable. It'll wash away, it'll rinse away from the soil. You don't want it to rinse away too much. You really want to hang on one second. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Okay, the nitrogen, it'll go away. So when you do your compost, you want to make sure you add lots of nitrogen. That comes from green things like grass clippings, animal poo can have it, hair, feathers, all those types of things is where you get your nitrogen from. The nitrogen is responsible for photosynthesis. It's what makes the plant green. When you run out of nitrogen in it, you'll see that the old growth will start to turn yellow. The new growth on the plant will be a light green color. So let's see, then we have phosphorus. That's your next one. That's P. That's root growth. It promotes the flowering and the fruiting of the plants. So like when you have your tomatoes forming, when you're growing a plant that produces the flowers, that's one of the more important nutrients, is the phosphorus. You're going to get that comes from bat guanos, bone meals, worm casings, pig poo is a really good source of it. Shrimp waste. If you go to we go down and pick up shrimp from this coast and peel our own shrimps and stuff, all that stuff is really, really, really good for it. If you run short on phosphorus, and it really stunts the growth of your plants, they'll grow significantly slower. Potassium, that is something for the overall vigor of the plant, and it helps with the ripening of the fruits and disease resistance. So if you run out of that, your tomatoes might get hung up a little bit, where it's taking a really long time for them to ripen and stuff like that. So you want to keep that up too. That comes from goat manure, is one of the better sources of it. and wood ash. If you have a campfire or something like that, or a wood stove, you can save the ash out of that, and that's a really, really good source of potassium. You do want to add that in a limited amount, or else you can end up burning your plants, but it doesn't really take too much of it. Let's see, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, they're all important. They're all ones that your plant uses a little bit more, but not as important as the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And that's why when you look at the fertilizers, it just has mainly the NPK ratio. Calcium, it helps with new growth, and when the plant is creating cells, it helps build the cell walls. And it's good for the disease resistance too. You can get that from eggshells a lot of times. You can just crush them up, add them to your compost. You can also toast the eggshells in the oven. A lot of people do that. Then it turns to a powder easy, and it makes it a little more soluble. But it is a slow release one too. So if you just add it to your soil, it's going to take it a little while to break down. It's something you want to add on a regular basis. Let's see here. Okay, and I had some examples. Here it is. So if you're, this is what it kind of looks like. You can look up a lot of charts on the internet, and it'll show you pictures of what nutrient deficiencies look like. The nitrogen, your old leaves will yellow first, and the new leaves will come out light green. That's one way that you can look at a plant and see what's wrong with it and what type of compost you need to add to it. Phosphorus, your old leaves on it, the old ones are yellow, but there's green spots on them as well. With the nitrogen, the leaves just pretty much turn yellow. With the phosphorus, they turn yellow, but you'll see little teeny green spots on them. Potassium, at the edges of the leaf, there'll be yellow, like a little serration look, and then brown dots on the leaf. And like I said, this is all stuff you got to look up, and you can see pictures on the internet. It makes it a lot easier. But once you're able to identify these shortages, it really helps you to know what compost you need and what your soil is lacking. Calcium will have misshapen and stunted new leaves on it. They'll be like all deformed and twisted looking and gnarled. But it's kind of rare to have the calcium deficiencies. It can though. Magnesium, the leaves are yellow. There are dark veins on those leaves though. Yellow leaf with a dark vein. Sulfur, there's yellow in the new growth. That's how you can tell the sulfur from the nitrogen deficiency is the sulfur has yellow in the new growth, the nitrogen has yellow in the old growth, and the new leaves are the light green. So I just kind of wanted to go over that first before I start talking about how to make the compost and things like that, just so you can understand why there's different types of compost and what you need to add to it. So we got that there. So there's different types of compost and different ways to go about doing it. The easiest way to go about it is to just designate a spot and go throw everything that you have in there and let it sit. It takes maybe 2 years or so for something to really, really, really break down. Like let's say you're doing leaves or something, but if you don't turn it, it's really slow going. But the benefit of not turning it, letting it sit, is it helps a lot of the worms and the smaller critters get established in your soil. When you go out and flip it, it speeds up the process that it takes to make it. It gets air down into the soil, but it kind of messes with the critters. So if you're in a rush to get your soil, you want to go out and flip it. If you're not in a rush and you have plenty of room, I just let them sit. You can do multiple piles if you have the room. Let nature do its thing. Let the worms come up into it. And then when you go and transplant the soil to wherever it's going to go, it already has all those things in it. So when you flip it, it messes with the worm tunnels. Nothing wrong with it. You can totally do it that way too. That's the easiest way. If you want to get kind of fancy about it, you find your spot. You can build like pallets up, create a pile in the middle, or you can use like hog fencing or the wire fencing for goats and stuff like that. Pile it up in the middle. You want to keep it moist, but not soaking wet. So if you're really in a rush to do it, you want to flip it, you want to add water to it, but not to the point where it's just sopping wet. Just spray it down a little bit after you get done flipping it. That causes the bacteria in it to awaken and help process everything in it. So some of the other things that you can do, you can compost on site. This is something we do a lot around here. We have kind of raised beds that we're working on. And rather than till every year and go out with a tiller or anything, we haul the leaves, we haul sand, we put it directly on the spot of the bed. The advantages to that is you only have to move the stuff one time. You don't have to pick it up, move it to a compost pile, turn it all the time, and then move it to the bed. If you do it on the spot, it breaks down right where you want it. And once again, it brings in the worms, it brings in the bugs. And when it rains and when it gets wet, your nutrients don't leach away. When you're doing a compost pile out in the middle of nowhere, every time it gets overly wet, it sends all those nutrients either running down the soil, into the soil, or if you even have trees growing near where you choose to put your compost, the roots will grow up into your compost. The very first compost pile that we did here, I thought I found a nice spot over on the side of the house that wasn't far to walk to. It was right next to all the woods and the trees. And every time I'd go out to turn, I would have to fight the tree roots. And it is amazing how fast tree roots grow when they have access to your compost pile. I mean, it was like within a week, I had big, long sections that far going up into my compost pile. I tried to put down concrete underneath of it to keep the roots from growing out. Well, they just went around the concrete. So you have to take that into consideration with wherever you're putting your compost pile. So that's one of the reasons why we like to do it on site. You move it one time, you put it directly where it needs to go, and you can stir it a couple times throughout the winter if you're bored or something like that. It'll speed up the process, but even if you don't, it's fine. It's good to go either way.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
So so what you're saying is, if you're looking at, say, doing a garden, say next year or whatever, go ahead and start your compost pile where you're going to put the garden. Is that?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, you can do that. Really, if you're trying to build up your soil and to do it that way, it takes up to 7 years of adding stuff to it to get it the way that you really want it to be. So if you're planting a garden next year, the sooner you get to it, the better that it is. Like when the fall comes and the leaves come down, we rake all of our stuff up, take it over into where our beds are going to be. They're in the same spots every year, and let it break down throughout the course of the winter. And then every year that you do that, that soil gets a little bit nicer and a little bit nicer. I add wood chips to it. I add sand to it, a little bit of clay. And I'll get into all that here in a minute too, about how to improve your soils and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely. The sooner you do it, the better it is, the more time it has. If you try to put like leaves in at springtime when you plant, there's no time for the stuff to break down. It's still better than nothing. It keeps the weeds down and all that. But yeah, you want to give it as much time as you can. Another thing is, if you have a lot of room, we have a lot of wooded areas here. You can always rake leaves up into piles in the fall time and just leave them where they are. If you go get the following year, you go back out to that leaf pile, it'll be about half broken down. If you give it 2 years, it is beautiful, beautiful, beautiful leaf compost. So you don't always have to move it. You can just do it the easiest way if you have that type of room. Now down here in Mississippi where we're at, when you do rake the leaves and stuff like that, you got to look out because the snakes like to move up in it. So when you finally do go to do it, rake it really slowly and just make sure that you're not picking up a snake or nothing like that, because they will definitely surprise you here. But you need to have room. Not everybody just wants to have piles of leaves around in their yard. So you can compost on site, you can rake them, leave them in a pile. You can designate a spot. Like I said, make sure there's no trees. You want to have it near water so you can add water to it when you need to. Then there's also people that will compost in barrels and things like that. You can, either use a plastic 55-gallon blue barrel, or you can use like a 55-gallon drum. You drill holes in it and you can actually like roll it on its side. You put the lid back on and you can roll it on its side to rotate the compost. That's a really good, quick way to do it. The problems that you have with that is a lot of times it can hold too much moisture in it. So you got to really watch your moisture content. And then the other thing is too, like if you fill up a 55-gallon drum with leaves or grass clippings or whatever, by the time it gets done composting, you just have a little teeny thing of soil. So that's the other thing to consider, is how much compost do you need? If you only need a little bit, something like that works perfectly fine. But if you're trying to do a whole garden or anything like that, you really need to have multiple compost piles. I mean, 4, 5, 6, 7, the better. If you're waiting years to do it, then even more. Just the more the better, because dirt is, it's super valuable when you're trying to do this. Then they have like those professional kind of ones that you can buy, and they got little hand cranks on them and they spin them around. Those are really cool contraptions and everything. But my honest opinion about them is it's somebody's just trying to sell you something that you don't really need and trying to incorporate something else into it. Once again, you spend a lot of time doing it. You don't get much back out of it. They do work. They work very, very well, but it's only a little bit. And if you're just using it as a fertilizer or something like that, it's not too bad, I guess. But you're probably going to need more than that. So I would think about trying to do several piles, like I was saying. Then people compost with worms. You can build a wooden box and you can use the red wigglers. You can get night crawlers, or you can use the worms out of your garden and stuff like that, but they don't breed or break down things as efficiently. I've tried worms several times and I keep having really bad luck with them. With the way the temperature is here and the humidity, they end up just getting overrun by those black soldier fly larvae that people feed the chickens and stuff, the mealworms. They just end up taking over, and it's only a matter of time before the worms they give up, I guess. I don't know where they go. They just disappear. So I don't have luck with worms. There are a lot of people that do. They produce super, super, super good compost. It's really high in nitrogen. It's got lots of the essential nutrients and stuff in it. If you can make it work, or you want to put the effort into it, that is a great way to break things down. But once again, it boils down that you're not going to end up with a whole lot of dirt from it. You go through a lot. Last time I got red wigglers, I think it was like 5,000 of them for 30 or 40 bucks or something like that. So it was kind of pricey, and you don't end up with a whole lot. One of the other things that you can do, and we do this here, is make a compost tea. You can take like a 55-gallon drum or a big trash can. You fill it up with water. Then you take like a stocking or a mesh bag or something like that, and you fill it with compost out your compost pile. And once again, depending on the type of compost that you start with, will alter the type of nutrients in it. So you take it in a mesh bag, you put it down into your water, and you can let it sit, and that'll create a compost tea. If you really want to get it good, get an air pump like they use for an aquarium, and you pump air into the water. And what that does, the air, not only does it knock against the nutrients and break them loose, and it makes it more water soluble, it increases the amount of aerobic bacteria that are in the water, and it helps when you add it to the soils. So the compost teas, we kind of use those as more of a fertilizer throughout the season here. I keep a couple barrels out front that's pretty close to the garden, and depending on what season it is, like I was talking about earlier, if it's early in the season, you want something with more nitrogen, you can use your animal poos out of your compost and stuff like that and put them in there, and you just water it to your plants. And it's a water soluble, quick release fertilizer that keeps them going pretty good through the summer. But you got to invest in an air pump if you really, really want it to be quick. If you just let it soak, it can cause rot. It works, but not as good as with the air pump. With an air pump, you can have it ready to go within 3 or 4 days. If it's warm outside, you'll see it bubbling off of the top of the water there, and you know it's ready to go. Like I said, it's all stuff you can look into if it seems like something that might work for you. And then there's also what I think is probably one of the better ways of doing compost, which is called hugelkultur. And what that is, it's kind of like imitating what's in the woods. You know, when you go in the woods, most plants don't have nutrient deficiencies. Well, why don't they have nutrient deficiencies? because there's a nice system in place. The branches fall off the trees, the leaves fall down, everything decomposes right on site. It doesn't rinse away. It's where it needs to be. So kind of what you're doing in that situation is you're creating that in your garden. You can either use rows or you can use like the raised beds. And what you're going to do is your first layer of having it, you want big branches, chunks of trees, old firewood that's rotted. You want your big, heavy stuff down on the bottom layer. You're going to create a row or the bottom of your bed with that. Then you take all your little gaps that you have in between it and you fill it with compost at your compost pile, leaves, kitchen waste, anything like that that you got, fish bones and all that type of stuff. You put them down in the gaps. Then you fill 3 to 6 inches of soil over top of it, creating like a mound. And then you fill the very top with straw or leaves to cover it up and to keep the water in. So what you've done is you've created a place where the wood is going to rot very slowly, and it releases the nutrients over the course of many years, depending on how hard the wood and everything that you put in there was. So all you have to do is top this off. So if you have a raised bed or something, you build this first, you put your dirt in, you get it built up really high, and you plant your plants in it. And then as the season goes, all you have to do is top off the top. You won't have to stir it. You don't have to till it or anything like that. You just leave it alone. And it takes years for that stuff to break down, and it feeds it just constantly. So those are pretty much your best ways of trying to compost. You can either designate a spot, like I said, you can either choose to flip it and water it, or you can choose to let it sit. It all depends on how quickly you need it. Composting on site, raking leaves and leaving them in place. You can do your barrels where you can flip it around and do everything like that. You can compost with the worms, the compost tea, but like I said, that's more of like a fertilizer. I would highly recommend that method for looking into. It really helps to not have to carry compost out constantly, and just those little touch-ups at least once a week when your tomatoes and stuff are producing, it really keeps it going and it makes a huge difference. And then the hugel culture, which that's another great way to get into it, because once again, you only have to move it one time and it composts in spot. You don't have to pick it up again. You never have to deal with it for years and years and years. And when the nutrients leach into the soil, they stay in the places where the roots can reach them. The worms come in, all the good beneficial microbes take up shelter. So that's probably one of my favorite ways to do it there. So then you spend all this time and you make up your compost. Like I said, depending on the type of compost that you're making, if you're doing something like blueberries or an acidic loving plant, you want to use pine needles or something very acidic. Compost in general has a pH level of between 6 and 7, which is about what most plants want. Majority of the time, compost will either take an acidic soil and neutralize it, or it will take an alkaline soil and neutralize it. Sometimes you do have to add things like lime and stuff like that. But if you keep composting right, it usually kind of balances itself out. Like I was saying with the blueberries and stuff, blueberries like a pH between 4 and 5, which is something acidic. So you want to make compost out of pine needles with something that has like a pH of like 3 or 4. Now, if you take like pine needles, you make you a nice compost out of pine needles, make a nice compost out of some leaves, and you can kind of mix them too to make sure you get to a good pH level for what you want. Each plant is a little bit different, so you kind of got to research everything, but majority of the plants, like I said, they like it between 5 and 6, so you don't need to mess with the pine needles for that, but some things do. Let's see. When you do leaves, one of the things to think about too is there are some leaves that inhibit growth. There are hickories down here that when they drop their leaves, they release a chemical so no other plants can grow there. So if you do use leaves, you want to make sure if you are using hickory and stuff, it is extremely well composted, or else it can kind of backfire on you if you didn't let it break down long enough. Oak leaves have a lot of tannins, so that kind of makes them acidic too. Maple leaves are probably one of the better leaves to use. They don't have any tannins in them. They're not acidic. It's kind of a nice neutral leaf. So if you have maple trees around you, that's one of our favorites here. Let's see, sawdust. One of the other things, you can make compost out of sawdust. If you know somebody that's cutting up trees, you can use the sawdust, but make sure that they're using a natural oil with it. I didn't think about that until somebody brought it to my attention years ago. And when you're running a saw, you have oil that comes out that cools your chain for you. So if you're just using like motor oil and you try to compost that, you're going to be eating motor oil essentially. But there are vegetable oil based chainsaw oils that work, that don't mess up your blade or anything like that, and you can totally compost it. So just consider that if you ever try to do sawdust. I see people selling it all the time, and like big old sacks of it from lumber mills and stuff like that. And it's like, well, you really got to think about that before you put it on your plants. Grass clippings. If you use grass clippings, make sure you know where they come from. You don't want to use grass clippings just like out of a random person's yard in a neighborhood, because a lot of times they put chemicals on them and you get pesticides and things like that in your compost, and it'll wreak havoc too when you finally put it in your garden. And the other thing to look out for is seeds when you use grass clippings. My first few batches of compost were made out of grass clippings, and I didn't think about any of that, and I ended up with grass just coming up everywhere. And you spend more time trying to pull the plants up than you're getting value out of using something like that. So if you do use grass clippings, just make sure there's no seeds and no chemicals. And the same thing with animal manure. So my second type of compost that I ever did, I got some horse manure from the neighbor, and he had let it sit, and I didn't think much of it. I go and put it all in the garden, mix it in with all the soil, everything starts growing really good. And then all of a sudden, weeds that I didn't have before started popping up out of everything. And to this day, there are weeds all over my property now that I have never had here, and I can't get rid of them. The ones that come from horse manure and cow manure are some of the hardest to get rid of weeds that you'll get. And it is a nightmare. So really think about it before you use like a grazing animal like that, because it's going to have those seeds in it. Now, you can, when you go to make your compost, I'm sorry, I'm kind of all over the place here, but it's just kind of one thing leads me to another. So when you're making your compost pile, if you have a lot of brown colored stuff, that's your carbons, like leaves and things like that, you want to add green stuff to it as well. That's your nitrogen, because that causes the pile to heat up and break down quicker. You don't have to do it that way, but if you're trying to make something varied, you want about a third green to about 2/3 brown, and kind of alternate your layers. And what I was getting to here is when you add the green to your compost pile, it causes your compost pile to heat up. Well, a lot of places that you read and people you talk to will tell you that you can get your compost pile and it kills off those weed seeds. And it might kill some of them, but trust me, when you're trying to deal with the animal poos and things like that, and the seeds and weeds and things like that, you won't get them all. So even if it kills 99% of the 10 billion seeds that you have in your compost pile, the ones that get through are going to be a nightmare. So you can heat them up to kill them. It doesn't always work that way though. So don't count on the fact that you're adding the nitrogen to your pile to heat it up to do that job, because I have been failed by that many times. And if you add too much nitrogen, it can also kill off your good microorganisms in there too, because it heats it up too hot. I've never seen it happen, but apparently if back in the day, there was hay bales that would catch on fire because they would harvest it too early while it was green. And if it had just the right amount of moisture in it, when they would bale these hay bales up for their cows and stuff, they would spontaneously combust and just catch on fire. I've never seen it happen, but I have read accounts of it. So it's something to think of. If you got too much green in there, it will get too hot. So think of all that too. Kitchen waste. That's one of the other things that you can make your compost out of. The problem with that is it is very, very hard to gather enough kitchen waste to actually make it worthwhile. I have a box out on my front porch that I made that we take our kitchen waste to. It's been there for about a year and a half or so. And I'm going to say I probably got about 4 inches of dirt in the bottom of that thing. And we feed a lot of our stuff to our animals and things like that too, but we still produce kitchen waste. But when it all boils down, you're not going to get a whole lot of it. It's probably going to be a really nutritious compost. So it's something good to add just to kind of fertilizer to bring something back. It's not a type of compost you want to make, and expect to make an entire raised bed, or you're going to give to a whole row of food or anything like of crop or anything like that. Okay, so talked about the different ways of making the compost and the different things you can use in it. So if you're an area like we're at here, we have a very high clay soil, and a lot of the people like further south of us and further north of us, they have really rocky or sandy soil. There's not a lot of nutritional or organic material in it. So you have to use compost here to improve your soils, and that's in almost everywhere now. I mean, there's very few places that have good virgin soil left. So you need to learn how to use compost to improve what is there with you. Now, if you think of like a triangle with one point of it being clay, one point of it being sand, and one point of it being compost, those are the 3 main ingredients that you need to have decent soil. There's obviously other things you can add to it and stuff like that, but all plants, they're happy in some combination of it. Some, like ferns, like really wet feet or wet roots, like they call. So you would want something with more compost and more clay, because the clay holds water. The compost holds water to an extent, but that's pretty much your food. And the sand causes more air and more drainage. So if you're doing something like a cactus or a succulent, you want something with more sand, less clay, and a little bit of compost. Most garden plants are happy with about a third of each or so, a third clay, a third sand, a third compost, give or take. If you try to stick with that third rule, you take your compost, and it doesn't need to be exact. People do turn it into a science, but it doesn't need to be. You just do a third, a third, a third. 90% of your vegetables in your garden are going to be very, very, very happy with that. If you go and put just compost, and you just keep adding compost and keep adding compost to your plants or your raised beds or whatever, and don't ever add sand and don't ever add clay, it gets to the point where it just doesn't want to drain. It'll hold a lot of water in it, and it doesn't get the oxygen down to the roots because it doesn't have the sand in it. And then when it does dry out, which it'll dry out really quickly, there's no clay in it to hold the water for the long term. So you don't want to just keep adding compost. You at least want to get some sand and toss some sand in there while you're doing it like that too. When you're dealing with improving your soils, one of the more important things you got to go back and look at is the pH levels of it. Always start out with, you can get little test strips that they sell on Amazon, a pH strip, and you can very easily just do a little water solution in a cup and stick it in there and see what the pH level of your soil is that you're starting with. If you have a really acidic soil, you don't want to keep adding acidic compost or anything to it. Most plants are happy between 6 and 7. Most compost, when you get done with it, is usually between a 6 and an 8. So there are sometimes you might have to acidify your compost or your soil. Not very often, but occasionally you do. So it's just something to take into consideration there, that pH is pretty important. But usually it falls into line on its own. Let's see. If you want to learn more about the different NPK ratios of things to start your compost with, there is a website called the nutrientcompany.com. I'm not affiliated with them or anything like that, but they have a thing on their website. It's called the organic NPK values, and you can look up pretty much anything. It'll tell you what the NPK value of blood meal is, what bone meal, what fish scraps, what your chicken poos, your sheep, it'll tell you what the values are of that. So if you want to start trying to make a customized type of compost, you know where you're starting with. Short of getting everything tested individually, there's a lot of variation. You know, they'll tell you the NPK ratio of cow poo. Let's see, it's 0.6, 0.4, 0.5 NPK. But it also depends on the time of the year that cow's alive. Is it on free range? Is it being fed grain? Is it being, you know, is it eating hay? There's a lot of variation. So when you do look things up, you got to realize it's not exact unless you get it tested. Your local extension services always offer soil testing. You can send the manure in, you can send them pretty much anything, and they'll tell you what's in it. So if you really want to be exact, that's the way to go. You need to test it. Like I was saying, with opening the rabbit holes with this stuff, you can really get deep into it trying to create different compost recipes, but you don't have to. As long as you're paying attention to if something's acidic or not acidic and you're in a general vicinity, you're going to be okay. The better things that you put into your compost, the better your compost is going to be. The better your compost is, the better your food's going to be. The more nutrition it's going to have, the more flavor it's going to have. So that's kind of the point of trying to do different types of compost, is just to make sure it's getting what it needs. Back to things to put into it. I was just thinking, a lot of people tell you not to use animal scraps in your compost piles. There's a lot of reason to it. If you use animal scraps and stuff in your compost piles, it can cause animals to come dig your stuff up. There's nothing worse than having a little bone or something in your garden bed and your dog smells it and comes over and digs your tomato plants up because he smells a bone down in the soil. It'll cause flies and things like that in your compost, but it's not really bad. It actually is pretty nutritious. I know the natives and everything, and all over the world, they used to bury fish with their food when they would grow something. And fish is a pretty nutritious thing. Believe it, it's like a 666. Well, okay, on the NPK scale, and it's pretty nutritious. So they would do that. That was one of the earlier forms of fertilizer, which is burying fish bones and fish skin and the innards and all that stuff with it. So a lot of people say not to do that type of stuff. If you have the right environment and you're not worried about animals digging up your stuff, it is pretty good to use. You know, bone meal is nothing but baked bone that's been ground up into a powder. Blood meal is nothing but, dried up blood. So when you go buy these fertilizers, a lot of times you are buying an animal product, but you don't want to do it in a place that's going to cause wildlife to come up into your yard and things like that. I know I was kind of all over the place there with a lot of that, but like I said, I can get rambling with soil. So are there any questions? Did I gloss over anything? Did I maybe skip something?
Feel free to unmute and ask questions or something. Or if you don't want to ask out loud, just do it over in the chat section. I'll be happy to ask them.
No, it takes a lot of work to do all this, but it's all well worth it. It's you get to use things that you have on your own property a lot of times, and once you get the system going, it's kind of hard starting out because the first few times you don't have a lot of soil. It takes a long time to really get it going, but once it gets going and you have multiple piles, it gets a little bit easier. So the main thing is just to stick with it, keep doing it. You got to be patient with it, and in the end, it's well worth it. You have a better quality food, you have more nutrition, but you just got to keep up on it. And if you have animals, don't waste the animal manure if you can avoid it. You don't usually want to use dog or cat or anything like that. Is pretty much any predatory animal they say not to use because the fact it can transfer disease and stuff like that. Some people say not to use pig manure because of the same thing. You can catch E. coli and stuff like that, but you can catch stuff from chicken poo if it's not properly composted. And the other thing is, if you do use a manure, don't just set it down at the base of your plant, because with the rain, and when it gets watered, it will cause it to splash up onto your fruits and stuff like that. So you don't want to eat it. That can definitely make you sick. And as Brian just said, the rabbit's his favorite. Rabbit is actually, of all the foods that I know of, it's the highest concentrate of nutrients in it. It's very, very good. It's well rounded. It has a lot of nitrogen in it. And there's also what's called hot and cold manures, meaning you could put rabbit food directly into the soil. It's not going to burn your plant. It's not going to hurt nothing. If you took too much chicken manure and put it on your plant, you can kill your plant. You have to let the chicken manure compost before you use it. That's what a hot manure is. But yeah, rabbit is definitely a very, 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 very good one to use.
I heard you mention earlier about worms and worm compost. Because of your neck of the woods and the humidity and moisture and stuff, it's not very good. But I've read a lot of good articles where it is very good. It takes a while to get going because you have to have a buttload of worms, of course. But I've known people that does worm farming and they use it and they say it's very good too. But again, like you said, you have to go with what works for you in your area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people down here do successfully farm worms. I haven't figured it out right. So, but I know the ground there, when we do the on-site composting and stuff like that. I mean, you move stuff back there, loaded with worms down in there. They're here. They're just they're hard to control, and they just kind of want to do their own thing, I guess.
Now, did I hear you? I didn't want to interrupt again, but I heard you earlier. Did you mention about various seafoods? Like the byproducts of the seafood, like shells from shrimp and all that kind of stuff is also very good.
Yeah, any type of seafood like that, really. I mean, even if you're in a place that you can get kelp from, you can't get it down here or anything, but up north, it just washes up on the shore. They're full of so many of the micronutrients and well, even the macronutrients too. They're very, very loaded. The shrimp shells. Let's see if I have it written down somewhere here. No, I don't have it written down. But yeah, the shrimp shells, they have a lot of nitrogen in them. You can use crab shells. You got to break it up. And
sure,
when it's something hard like that, it's a long-term fertilizer, meaning when you add it to your soil, it's not going to be readily available to your plant, but over the course of years, it slowly breaks down. So you definitely want to try to add stuff like that to it if you can, because it makes it last 10 times longer. So yeah, fish waste, crab shells, shrimp shells. What we do is when we do our shrimp, we go down and get a bulk thing of shrimp. I come dehead them, and I take the heads and make a broth out of it that we use to mix with our dog food. So they get like a really healthy, nutritious broth out of it. I would feed them the heads, but they're really pointy on the ends, and I'm afraid of one piercing its tongue or whatever.
Sure.
But then you can take the shells and the heads, and we compost those. And it might stink in the compost pile for a week or something like that and draw some flies in. But once it breaks down, it's super good, super nutritious stuff. And, like I said, it's slow release. So it's really good for your composts.
Now, would that go the same for just regular, like, I'm kind of landlocked here in Kentucky. I don't have an ocean very close to me, but would like ponds, like fish waste from the ponds, like we go out fishing, the scales, the bones, once we fillet them and stuff, would all that still be
absolutely
the same category? Okay. All right.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like I said, the natives and a lot of cultures around the world have used that to feed their plants for a long time, and it's super nutritious. And let's say, yep. Brian says you can also blend the shrimp and fish. Yep, you turn it into a mush. It's even more readily available even that way. But yep, totally good to use. Like I said, just keep it safe so animals and stuff aren't digging in it, because they'll just make a big, huge mess. And totally works. Yes, anything. It doesn't matter if it's out of the ocean or out of a lake or out of a river. Then something else to consider too is if you are fishing it like maybe a polluted source of water, you might want to consider that, because I know some places they have those mercury warnings when you go fishing at them. So you have to kind of watch out and make sure you're not putting something that's like a super concentrated amount of mercury or toxins or anything like that.
Sure. What about I heard you mention about certain woods because of the natural chemicals in them when they decompose. What about for like nuts, like walnuts and stuff? I know certain shells are not good
Yep.
because of
Yeah.
the, I mean,
Yeah, the shells do the same thing with them. They have extreme high concentrations of the tannins in them and stuff, and it does not allow anything other than the plant that it falls from to pretty much grow. So it just kind of helps keep everything else at bay. And this is off topic here, but if you take those nut shells, like we have like the hickories and we've got walnuts and stuff that grow here, if you take them and soak them in a bucket of water, it'll get like a tea color to it, like super, super, super dark.
yeah.
But we have fire ants down here, and if you dump that liquid on top of your fire ant pile, they take off. That works better than any ant poison I have ever seen. And it kind of stays in the soil. So you dump it in there, you dump it really, really slow so it goes down into the ant pile, and they don't come back.
That's
So,
neat.
off topic there, but it's a good use for them. You know, if you're going to have something like that, you find a use for it. So
Sure, makes sense.
and we have bees here, so we can't use the regular ant poisons because it gets into the flowers and then it gets back into the bees and kills the bees off and all that stuff. So I've had to try to come up with natural ways to get rid of the fire ants down here, and that seems to be the best way so far, other than boiling water. But it takes a lot to keep boiling water constantly when you have 4,000 ant piles in your yard.
Anyone else have any questions? All right, everyone. Well, Mike, again, thank you for inviting us into your home, sharing your knowledge with us and stuff. I'm sure you'll be back. We've already talked about a possible another class coming up with you. So thank you for your time and your wife allowing us to steal you for a few hours this evening.
Yep, I hope everybody learned something. I didn't just ramble too much. Like I said, I can go on and on and on about soil, and I'm trying to pick out the most important things about it. So it's all important to me.
Right. Well, again, thank you. So again, everyone, thank you for your time. Mike, we appreciate it. Everyone, y'all have a good night and be safe. We hope you found this class beneficial and that it gives you a good starting point for making more rich and fertile soil with the addition of composting. We have a lot more learning opportunities coming this year. In addition to virtual Zoom classes each month, we will be adding some interviews as well as custom content. We also have 4 great in-person learning and fellowship opportunities coming up. First, we have the Patriot Homesteaders Conference, April 28th through the 30th at the Scott County Fairgrounds in Scottsburg, Indiana. We have the Kentucky M.A.G Meet and Greet Campout, June 21st through the 25th at Double J Stables in Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. We have the Kentucky Bushcraft Weekend, July 21st through the 23rd at Double J Stables in Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. We also have the Heartland Homesteading Conference, September 29th through October 1st at Home Place on the Green River in Campbellsville, Kentucky. We are working on more great learning and fellowship opportunities, so be sure to subscribe and like our YouTube channel or join one of our Facebook groups to keep up with the latest information. And again, I want to thank Mike Kidwell from the Lizard Patch Farmstead in Mississippi for opening up his home to us and sharing some great information. On behalf of the M.A.G Network, I am Indy Guy. Be safe and have the knowledge.